I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Megan Peters. She is a cognitive neuroscientist and a professor of cognitive sciences at the University of California, Irvine, where she directs the Cognitive and Neural Computation Lab, researching topics related to perception, metacognition, and how the brain processes uncertainty. Megan, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. So I'd like to ask you about your background. How did you first become exposed to cognitive science or neuroscience?
Sure, yeah. So I think when I talk about the answer to this type of question, I usually like to start in high school because I think that's where my interest in the mind really began. Mm-hmm. So in high school, I was really interested in I took like a philosophy of mind class, which I got to help design myself, and it was kind of an independent study. And that really kind of introduced me to the idea of this distinction between like what your mind thinks is out there in the world and what is actually out there in the world, as long as you believe that there is a physical world out there. Mm-hmm. And so being introduced to that distinction then kind of got coupled with, I was also really super into math when I was in high school. And so I went to college with this idea that I would definitely do something that involved a lot of math. And I was really into physics. And I thought, well, I can do philosophy or something on the side. And I got to college and like had to pick my classes. And suddenly I was like, I don't want to do astrophysics anymore. I want to do something that has to do with history of science and neuroscience. And there were all of these topics that just sounded so fascinating to me. So I spent my first year of college kind of exploring in the philosophy, neuroscience, history of science kind of realm. And I spent my first year of college at Smith College, and then I transferred to Brown University. And Brown has a cognitive sciences major, and Smith didn't. Or it used to have a cognitive sciences major. I think it's gone now. I think it's been eaten by the psychology department.
You're lucky.
But then, so when I got to Brown, Cog Sci was like, oh, this is all of the things I love in one spot. Mm-hmm. So I got to do philosophy and linguistics and computer science, and a little bit of statistics, math kind of stuff, and then also psychology and neuroscience. And so it was all like in this nice little package. Mm-hmm. That I got to tick all of the boxes of things that I was really interested in. And so that led me to, because Brown also, they have these concentrations, but outside of the requirements for the concentration, you're free to kind of do whatever you want. And you're supposed to just take 4 classes every semester. So I picked up a lot more philosophy here and there. I picked up like some anthropology classes and stuff. So, so that collection led me to really start focusing in on being fascinated by still the relationship between subjective perception, like the experience that we have of being ourselves, like navigating around in the world, like the guy in the driver's seat, the difference between that experience and what's out there in the world, and how that subjective experience can differ across individuals. And so I was fascinated by classic thought experiments in philosophy of mind, like, the redness of red, is that different for you than it is for me? And so my senior thesis at Brown was about trying to understand the relationship between introspective capacities, so our ability to reflect on our own thoughts and perceptions and so on. And so the relationship between that capacity and theory of mind, so the ability to simulate and think about other people's thoughts. And this was right about the time that there was a lot of work coming out about the relationship between introspection and theory of mind. It was before it became kind of an established idea, I guess. So I did this little project that statistically didn't work out, and we don't need to talk about that. But all of this then led me to really sharpen what I thought I wanted to do, which was to understand other people's subjective experiences, and especially how those experiences differed, not just across individuals, but across different psychiatric or neurological disorders or developmental disorders. So I had this idea in my mind that the best way to do that would be to go into clinical psychology and to actually, from a research and clinical standpoint, get to understand what it is like to live in somebody else's head, what it is like to be you. And so that was kind of my target. But then I also had this other goal, which was I'd never gotten to live abroad, and I wanted to go do that. And so I went and lived in Japan for a year and kind of took a little while to collect myself. And then the awful thing happened, which is I applied to all these graduate programs and I didn't even get a single interview.
Oh no.
And this was while I was living abroad, and I had this kind of crisis moment where I was like, oh no, like this has been my path the whole time. I was supposed to like go to college and then take a little bit of time off and then go to graduate school and become like a clinical psychologist. That's what I'm supposed to do. But it turned out that that was the best possible thing, because then I came back to the States and I worked as a research assistant, as a lab manager for 2 years. And during that time, not only was I exposed more to the minutiae of what it's like to do research, the lab was an infant language development lab, and language development,
Toby Mintz, right?
Yeah, exactly. Toby Mintz at USC. And language learning is about picking up on statistical patterns as much as it is about a lot of other stuff. And so this got me really fascinated by, well, one of the driving forces behind our construction of our perception of reality has to be a susceptibility and a sensitivity to these statistical patterns in the environment. And it's not just language, it's everywhere. Everything is a statistical pattern, and our brains are really super good at picking up on those patterns. And our ability to pick up on those patterns and internalize them shapes our perception of the world. So it all came back to this idea of subjective reality, essentially, like the difference between subjective reality and objective reality.
That very Kantian idea of like, is what we perceive out there really real, or are we perceiving it only through the veil of our perception?
Exactly. Veil of perception, all of that good stuff. Perception as an inference process, et cetera, et cetera. So, so all of that kind of led me to this realization that, I didn't really want to do clinical psychology. I wanted to do basic research. Like there was so much we didn't know about how our sensitivity to these patterns in the environment shapes who we are, shapes how we feel about who we are and how we carry ourselves and navigate the world. So then I applied to and got in, applied again, took the GRE again, applied again, and this time I got in a bunch of places, and I was able to select a multisensory integration lab led by Ledan Shams at UCLA. And so there I got to not only look at Bayesian inference processes that lead to perceptual decisions and ultimately like conscious percepts, but I also got to get into the modeling part, which then resurrected my love of math. So it was like this perfect confluence of math and subjective experience. And then I got to do my postdoc also at UCLA with Hak-Wan Lau, where I took all of the math tools and modeling tools that I learned in my PhD and then pointed them directly at metacognition and consciousness. So meandering path through lots of different things, but I think there was a core thread all the way through that drove me and kept me focused, even if I'm only realizing it now looking back.
Yeah, that's exciting. It's remarkable to me how similar our paths were, at least up until the grad school part, because I also started off interested in astrophysics and eventually transitioned to cognitive science and thought about dabbling in clinical psychology, but eventually went down the neuroscience route myself. So you mentioned earlier this core interest in studying subjective experience motivated by these sort of philosophical questions, but then a way to test these empirically and combine that with your quantitative interests. Now, during that time, or even now, were you sort of the materialist mindset of like the brain is sort of a machine or like a computer, and if we have all these pieces, then we get our subjective experiences out of that? Or were you of the more philosophical type, thinking like there's just something about consciousness that might be ineffable, or like qualia, like you mentioned with the experiencing colors or anything like that.
Oh, you are jumping right into the hard questions. Okay, so I think that if you have to push me to pick one of these binarized options, I'm going to pick the reductionist materialist approach. I think that I don't think that there's anything, magical about consciousness. I think that we do not yet have the tools, and possibly not even like the right paradigm, the right framework to understand that. So when we talk about scientific paradigms, Thomas Kuhn, structure of scientific revolutions, all that cool philosophy of science stuff, I think we might not be there yet with consciousness. But I think that we're starting to understand the types of questions that might help us get there, even if we're way far off from solving it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if you pushed me, I would pick the materialism approach. But I think that the materialism approach is often oversimplified. So I don't think that just by studying neuron morphology or brain areas, the new phrenology kind of approach to neuroscience, I don't think that's going to be enough. I think we need the computational approaches. I think we need to understand information processing. I think we need to understand not just like what the brain is doing, but how to mimic those types of computations maybe in other systems. That kind of approach has a better chance of being fruitful.
Yeah.
But I don't, so in that way, like the dualism approach, like there's something ineffable, like qualia is its own natural kind, that kind of thing. It feels like they're going to converge. That when we talk about consciousness as being this ineffable, qualitatively different thing that is not a brain and is not physical stuff, that it feels like it's skipping the fact that information is not a physical thing, but yet information is really a thing.
Right.
And so I think once we resolve that the gap between these two binarized options that you presented might not go away, but it's going to start closing.
Right. Yeah, I notice I seem to have a knack for presenting false dichotomies in terms of these binaries, like nature versus nurture, and everyone always says, well, it's both, or it's somewhere in between. Now, do you think in this case, one example of that convergence might be something like the sum or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts? So it's almost like you could say that, I'll use a chemistry analogy. Like, let's say you get together a bunch of different elements, and without a certain critical mass, let's say, or an energy input to the system, they're kind of just going to do their own thing. But then at a certain point, you have a threshold where there's like a phase transition. Is it something like that, where maybe you have a bunch of neurons and it's a simple, at least comparatively simple type of thing, and then eventually, once it reaches a certain level of complexity, you get this new thing like qualia?
Yeah, so you're asking about like levels of consciousness, and I can envision that this conversation is going to go into like, is a slug conscious versus is a mouse conscious versus is a human conscious kind of thing. I think that the idea of criticality and the idea that consciousness might be an emergent property such that it is, again, going back to this idea of natural kind, that it's a fundamentally different natural kind that is generated by constituent parts, and that the sum or the collection of those constituent parts is more than each constituent part alone, and just adding them up kind of in a linear fashion. I totally, yeah, that's totally reasonable. To expect that there is a critical point. This kind of approach, I think, is often used to talk about consciousness, right? You talk about at what point does a few grains of sand become a pile, or at what point does the ability to react to information in the environment in a reflexive manner suddenly exhibit goal-directed behavior or something. And I don't know where that line is. I don't even know if there is a line. But I do think that, yeah, that some truly satisfying explanation of what consciousness is and how it arises is not going to be reducible to just like, here are the puzzle pieces, put them together.
Right. And even in terms of describing things in the real world, like when do that pile of sand when does it become a pile instead of just a bunch of grains? It seems like it's so messy because of that subjective component. So maybe we can tie it back into your research, because on one hand you have perception, which is seemingly this objective thing because the matter actually exists out there, and you can describe the way that your brain or your eyes or whatever sensory organ is perceiving this matter. But then on the other hand, that gets translated into this subjective experience.
Sure. Yeah, I think, I do think that, I mean, it all relates to, this is why I'm so interested in talking about this stuff, is that it's like the core of everything that I do and most of what I think about all the time. Yeah, I'm not sure I heard the question though.
Well, I think it would be great to have a brief overview of some of the topics you're in your research first, and then we can tie it into these more philosophical questions.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what are we doing now? So after my postdoc, and then in my first faculty position at Riverside in bioengineering, and now here at UC Irvine in cognitive sciences, we've kind of had this goal of using a combination of computational approaches, and this isn't just machine learning, this is also like Bayesian ideal observer analysis, computational models, signal detection theory kind of stuff. So we take those on one side, and then we also have neuroimaging approaches like fMRI and EEG, and we're trying to use these tools to design clever behavioral experiments that push around on subjective experience and objective information processing in different ways, and which then try to understand how neural representations of either of those things or both of those things together work. What are the neural representations? Can we understand what information is being encoded where and how in the brain, and then use abstracted models to guess at how that information is being used to drive like these perceptual inference processes and our subjective experiences about those inferences. Yeah, so that's the
like critical values, like at what point of information does the perception switch from this thing to this thing, or how much uncertainty can you tolerate while still having the subjective experience be intact, things like that?
I think part of what we're doing could be described under that framework, sure. So, you know, how much information can I add to a visual stimulus before you suddenly become aware of it? And previously you were not aware of that thing on the screen. And so information here and the thing to become aware of is not necessarily like an object that's on a screen, in which case I can like crank up the contrast until you can see it. That's not particularly exciting to me. What is exciting to me though is that I can mess around with aspects of that stimulus such that you do or do not become aware of various components of it, which we might call like the task relevant properties. So, you know, I show you a thing and I ask you to make judgments about the identity of that object. And then I ask you to make a confidence judgment about your decision about its identity. And we're trying to build ways of separating those things from each other, such that just because you can identify the object better doesn't mean that you have higher and higher confidence or lower and lower uncertainty about your decisions. Because if we can usually those go together. Like usually if you can see well, then you can see well and you know you can see well. That's like typically how this works in the world. And if it didn't work that way in the world, we'd be in trouble. But what we're trying to do then is separate this out so we can do things like hold your ability to see constant, but mess around with how well you think you can see. And that's kind of the holy grail here, is to be able to systematically do that under lots of different conditions, not just like stripy things and dots and very simple visual stimuli, but under a whole host of conditions and a whole range of performances and types of decisions that you might be making.
So one example of this, would that be like if the amount of light on the screen, let's say, is held constant, but the objects that the screen is presenting could vary. So like, so if you have something like, I don't know, just an ordinary object like a hammer versus something like a snake. I remember reading one paper saying that humans are particularly quick to respond to danger stimuli, snakes being up there. So is that one example where it's like we might think we see something more confidently because like there would be evolutionary reasons for that? Like if it's potentially dangerous, we're going to be more confident even if it might be fake.
That's an interesting example. We haven't tried that one. We did do something that was kind of similar for similar reasons that you just brought up, which is that dangerous stimuli and also signals of danger, like a fearful face. So when you see someone else who's making an expression of fear, that might kind of provide a direct line into the amygdala to be like, ooh, scary thing, right? And so we tried to create we did create this study where we tried to say, okay, are you able to process a fearful face better than, say, a happy face, yet that processing and that difference in processing is unconscious. And so if I ask you, how well can you process this thing, you might respond the same way in both cases. And it turns, that's not exactly what the study did, but it's kind of approximately what the study did. And it turns out that the results of that study suggested that detection of a fearful face and detection of a happy face, so positive valence, there wasn't really any difference. And that like, as soon as you could tell like whether the face was happy or fearful, you were able to place confidence appropriately on that decision. You were able to say like, yes, I got that right, or no, I didn't. Yeah.
Is that a surprising finding? Because ordinarily you hear about in psychology, there's sort of this negativity bias.
Yeah, and negative faces and fearful faces are special, or at least have been reported to be special in other papers, which is what drove us to design this study the way we did. But just because the result comes out one way in one study doesn't mean that if you change the paradigm a little bit, it's going to exactly do the same thing in another one. So we were a little surprised that even something that had been shown to kind of grease the wheels of processing, like processing of a fearful face, we were a little surprised to see that even that did not show this kind of ability to push around on perceptual performance capacity in the absence of changes of subjective awareness. So basically like you could do the task, but you don't know how well you can do the task. And we were surprised that the fearful face approach did not successfully induce that kind of blind sight-like behavior. You can do it, but you don't know you can do it. But you know, there's lots of other things to use. So we haven't tried snakes, for example, or like cockroaches or some other kind of like very visceral, like icky thing. Right. So maybe we could do that in the future and see if that's successful in creating a direct line into the amygdala that might change the relationship between your ability to do the task and your subjective experience of how well you think you can do the task.
So it sounds like your research isn't just focused on unconscious processes per se, like in one study where they flash a gun on the screen for like a millisecond and see the amygdala light up, even though people don't consciously perceive the stimulus. It sounds like your research focuses more on the interaction between conscious and unconscious processes.
I think that's a fair characterization. I will also say, though, that a lot of these subliminal priming studies, the measure of whether, like you flash a gun on the screen, you show the amygdala light up, and the measure of whether you saw it or not, like whether it was consciously processed or not, can often be, not always, some studies are better than others, but can often be like the experimenter basically saying, did you see it? And so then you're relying on this report that is really potentially susceptible to any sort of response bias. Like maybe you caught like a little glimmer, but like you think it doesn't count, and so you just report no. Right. So there are other studies that do a better job than that kind of flash something and then later show, you know, two photos and say, which one was the thing that I just showed you, or something like that. And then they want to show that D prime, like a measure of sensitivity, is at 0, is at like completely at chance. You're just totally guessing. Those are better, but a lot of studies that showed these subliminal priming effects, the effects are not, are the fact that the prime was subliminal is entirely resting upon a subjective report of like, did you see it? No? Okay, I count it as unconscious.
What if it's something like, you may or may not be presented with an image on the screen. Press the button when you see the image, if you see it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same kind of thing. It's like there's got to be, so this classic detection task, right? So there's got to be like some threshold where you're like, I saw it enough to press the button.
Yeah.
But just because you didn't press the button doesn't mean you didn't see anything at all.
Yeah.
So it's this like, you can infer that if they pressed the button, they saw it, but you cannot infer that if they didn't press the button, they didn't see it.
Yeah. So are there individual differences in individuals' willingness to report? Like, let's say 2 people see the same thing, but one person confidently reports on what they think they saw, and the other person like will second guess themselves and think, well, did I really see that, or was that really right? And then they decide like, okay, I'm gonna just pass.
Yeah, you can absolutely have individual differences. You can also push around on this with reward structures or just instructions to the person. And so the fact that you can push around on this with these other kind of variables suggests that this may not be the best way for us to understand whether something was truly unconsciously processed or not.
So are most of your studies looking at these very short time spans of perceptions, like you're flashing something on the screen for seconds?
Most of them, yeah. Most of them, I show you a thing, I ask you to press a button to tell me what you saw and how confident you were in that choice. So that's like the core of what we do, but then we do that in the scanner, and we do that with all sorts of crazy manipulations of the stimulus to try to induce cases where you are completely garbage at the task, but you think you're doing great, or vice versa. And so we've got some kind of clever manipulations that we've been working on developing and that others have developed over the years that we borrow from to try to screw around with your ability to do the task and your ability, your thoughts about how well you're doing separately, which is kind of fun.
What do you think those studies tell us about our outside behavior? So like outside of a lab setting, in longer time spans, when we're perceiving things that we see, that appear to us to be more static?
I think that's a good point. So, you know, everything that we perceive in an ecologically valid setting is more like a stream. It's like an ongoing experience. It's not these kind of short little discrete bursts of stuff that are presented in isolation. And so we know that in sequential decision-making tasks, sequential perception tasks, that whatever you did at time t-1 definitely influences what you're doing right now. So that's absolutely true. And there are actually a lot of models that take into account this ongoing stream of information, so that with the assumption that at every moment, your brain is still making decisions. Even if I'm not just showing you a thing and then asking you to report a decision, at every single moment, your brain is still saying, what's happening now? What's happening now? What's happening now? And so it's constantly making these little decisions, like continuously, basically.
Yeah.
And that nevertheless, if you discretize time, so to speak, and you say at time t-1, which might be like 1 millisecond ago, but whatever I decided was happening then, that's going to influence my perception now, for sure. And we can see that in the lab even. So you can design these little tasks where it's like you play like a little sequence of like tones. It's like beep, 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 and then suddenly it jumps. And you have to, and your brain has to decide like, okay, am I in a new situation now? Like that was a sequence of tones that happened under this mean and this variance of tonal frequency. And then suddenly there's a shift. And so there's a shift in the environment. How does your brain detect shifts in the environment when the environment is noisy?
Yeah.
And it does this by remembering what happened at time t-1. So we've got these kind of continuous measures that also happen in the lab, and confidence plays into this too. So it's not just what information was processed and what information was present, but also what you thought was going on. also affects what you're going to think is going on right now, even if what you thought was going on and what was actually going on are not the same thing.
Uh-huh. It seems like, especially with the rise of digital media and technology, we're starting to live in that more rapid shifting environment. I just did an episode with Neil Amram from Stanford, and he does screenomics research. So he's looking at time series analyses of basically digital behaviors. And he was talking about how every few seconds, people are on average are switching between different tasks on their smartphone. So it seems like, and then you could contrast that with like being outdoors in nature, where for the most part, things seem to be relatively static.
Yeah, there's a lot of really fascinating research on how the rate of change of the environment makes a difference in these sequential decision-making processes. How can we model that? How can we capture that quantitatively?
Yeah. Do you think it's just rate of change, or do you think there's also a perceived rate of change? And you
Oh yeah, I think it's all of the things. Yes, like rate of change, perceived rate of change, variability, perceived variability, perceived magnitude, actual magnitude of signal. Like yes, everything. And I think that there's so much really beautiful work on how we make decisions under uncertainty, from perceptual decisions to cognitive decisions, value-based decision making, who to vote for, what kind of restaurant do you want to go to tonight? All of these things can be like what stocks are you going to buy? You know, these are all decisions that we make under uncertainty all the time. What I think we should be doing is adding the layer of subjective experience on top of that. So all of the models that we have that are so beautiful and sophisticated, that are about how do we make decisions under uncertainty, kind of assume that the uncertainty is perfectly in the system, is perfectly or maybe imperfectly represented in your brain or in your mind. But a lot of them don't take into account the idea that there might be this secondary evaluation of uncertainty, and that the evaluation of uncertainty may or may not map onto the actual uncertainty, but nevertheless might influence your decision-making processes and subsequent behaviors.
Do you think in that case, the subjective experience would be the same thing as like having different strategies under uncertainty? So you could say there's the same amount of uncertainty or variance in whatever information you're being presented, and maybe there's like some mathematically optimal decision if it's like an economic decision-making game where you're aiming to maximize the amount of money you earn, for example. But then some people are gonna perceive the risk as higher than others just based on how either reward or risk sensitive they are. Do you think that sensitivity is where the subjective experience comes in?
I think that's certainly one aspect of it. Sure. I think that people, so you mentioned like this kind of subjective evaluation or subjective experience of risk, and risk aversion maybe, and like some kind of emotional reaction to risk even. And I think that absolutely that there are other components about the consequence of whatever cognitive system it is that evaluates uncertainty. The consequence being like the uncertainty that you actually experience subjectively. There are other components to that, absolutely, that have to do with, you know, emotions and past life experiences and all sorts of other stuff that I have no idea about because I study dots and stripes on screens.
Okay, so a thought that just popped into my mind that might bring this back into heavy philosophy territory is, are you familiar with Plato's theory of forms?
Why don't we go through it for the sake of the reader, for the listenership?
Yeah, and usually what'll happen is you might say yes, and then I'll say okay, and then I'll try and summarize.
Okay.
So the basic idea is that whatever thing we can think of, there's like this ideal form of it. So if you think tree, for example, there's going to be an image of tree that pops into your mind, and it will, according to Plato, be like the ideal tree. So back to what we were talking about with risk. Now there would be the actual level of risk, and then there would be the perceived level of risk, but there would also be something like what your ideal level of risk for this particular reward might be. So the question is, are we judging things, our perceptions, based on sort of, it could be an ideal, like a form type of expectation, or it could just be an expectation. So so the idea is whenever we're perceiving something or making a decision, do we have sort of a parallel thought process judging this relative to some ideal circumstance? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think I'm not really sure how to work in this idea of forms or exemplars, kind of in category-based learning. You might think of it as like exemplar, or like prototypes, not exemplars. So it kind of feels like, under the let me back up here for a second and try to unpack what you're suggesting. So under the circumstances, you have the actual level of uncertainty, the perceived level of uncertainty, and then this maybe ideal or target level of uncertainty.
I guess the
Is
idea
that fair?
would be that ideal might be something like your cutoff of action. So you would have an idea in mind of like, if the risk is above this level, then I won't act. But if it's below this level, then I'm comfortable with it. So
I see. Okay. So that's a little different than how I was thinking about it, because when I think ideal, when I hear ideal, my mind immediately goes to optimality and ideal observers, and like ideal or optimal.
That could be an additional dimension as well.
Like ideal under what's cost function scenario. But what you're suggesting is, kind of this target or threshold idea. I imagine that is the case, that there is, if you want to create a threshold for action, that there is, I would say that it is entirely plausible that there is a threshold for uncertainty or confidence that you must reach in order to actually do the action that you're planning to do. And so examples might be, you're driving down a road and it's foggy or something, and you are constantly having to decide, like, do I stop now? Do I stop now? Do I stop now? And so you have this level of uncertainty, but then you also have this decision variable of like a thing that might be out there in the road. And so the decision process is not so much only what is the thing and how uncertain am I, but also as a result of the level of uncertainty that I think I have, do I have enough information to even make a decision, or do I need to gather more information? And so the choice to not act and therefore gather more information, to withhold judgment essentially, is also something that I think fits into this scenario very nicely. So maybe that targets a little bit what you're asking about, which is this like threshold of like, okay, now I know enough, and so I'm going to be able to make a decision. And it's not so much that it's just the amount of information that you have, it's also the noise in that information that goes into this kind of comparison to a target or a threshold level of uncertainty.
Do you think there's any fundamental difference in the way we evaluate uncertainty versus the way that an algorithm might do so? Like, you could think of a self-driving car algorithm, for example, where similar example to what you were just saying, where do I stop or not stop? And we'll see the stop sign and decide to stop. The algorithm picks up on the stop sign in whatever way it does that may or may not be perception, and it decides to stop. Do you think those are the same processes?
Probably not right now. I think that in their most plain vanilla form, computer vision algorithms, or even just decision-making algorithms, like we can go back, I don't know, 10 years to IBM's Watson or whatever. I don't know if you watched it play Jeopardy, but it would do these things where it was just killing the other participants, the contestants. I mean, it was like just flying ahead of them. They were being left in the dust. But then when it was wrong, it would produce these answers where the answer is like actually, I don't know, peanut butter, but it would say baseball with 99% certainty or something. And so these are the kinds of failures or mismatches between decisional accuracy and confidence that we also do. We have lots of cases where humans make a completely wrong decision and yet are super sure in that decision, or vice versa, that they're correct, but they're like, I was totally just guessing. I have no idea whether I'm correct or not. So I think that there are cases in both artificial systems and in intelligent biological systems where confidence and accuracy don't match.
Right.
That's fair. But I think that the ways in which they don't match across artificial versus biological systems reveal that there are differences in the underlying computations.
Right.
So
with humans, if you get something wrong, there's usually like a train of thought that you can track, and it's like, oh, I see why you got it wrong, even if it was wrong.
Maybe, or maybe you can't even introspect on that. And like, even if
Sure.
I explain it to you, you might not be able to understand why you got it wrong.
Mhm.
But I think that just the fact that there are these gulfs in the metacognitive mistakes, I guess, that we make versus artificial systems are making, that reveal that the way that we evaluate our own uncertainty is likely to not be exactly the, equations that we've programmed into our self-driving cars.
Mhm.
But I think that that's actually a really fruitful avenue to go, because if we can use our own metacognitive failures to reverse engineer how we do it, then we can make artificial systems that evaluate uncertainty the way we do, and therefore can collaborate and communicate with us better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining two types of metacognition. This is probably another false dichotomy, but there's something like a metacognition of any particular task that you're currently engaged in. And then there's something like the generalizable metacognition to think about what you're doing like across circumstances. And it seems like humans have that generalizable metacognition, and machines might not, even if they have, let's say, better error detection in specific tasks.
So the question is about not even domain general versus domain specific metacognition, but more like metacognition in the moment, or self-evaluation in the moment, versus the ability to like optimally select a training regime or optimally select actions across time. Is that kind of the question?
I think both of those are interesting comparisons that I want to go down. So we can.
Okay, so the question is, are those things different, and how are they different between humans and machines?
Right.
Okay. Well, okay. Preface this by saying, not an AI researcher. Okay, so I don't keep up with the state of the art literature in machine learning. Nobody can. Okay.
Right. And then
especially since it's not my field.
In your
So,
research, your computational
yeah.
research, because it seems like there's an additional goal when you're aiming to mimic how humans are thinking, where it's like you don't necessarily want the most efficient solution. You want the one that would describe how our brain works, right?
Yeah. And I think also there are some cases where the study of how we both locally monitor our own uncertainty and kind of globally select how to act so that we can overall reduce our uncertainty in our environments, learn better, all of those things. Now, these are both things that only some AI or machine learning type models are actually doing right now in a way that I would call truly metacognitive. Sure, you can read out the entropy of the posterior distribution from some deep convolutional neural net or something, fine. But I don't think that that on the surface by itself all the time is going to reflect the type of metacognitive evaluation that we are doing, even in that local sense, for just this decision process or just this, image recognition algorithm or something. I think that what we need to do in both cases, both for local, like metacognitive evaluation of like this decision process right now, versus a global metacognitive evaluation of like, how do I reduce my uncertainty in the environment? How do I know what I don't know and therefore seek ways that might be able to reduce that uncertainty? Both of these things require extra metacognitive type modules. That even meta learning type approaches in machine learning, which are like, now I'm going to update these weights and now I'm going to update those weights so that I don't engage in catastrophic forgetting when I try to learn how to recognize piles of dog pictures versus piles of cat pictures. I think these are the kinds of approaches that we might need to go for, with, again, the caveat that I'm not a machine learning researcher. I don't know the state of the art of everything that's been done, but I think that the vanilla approaches, the standard approaches, don't do this. And that's maybe one of the reasons why we have things like catastrophic forgetting in our artificial architectures, because they don't know how to kind of select the mode of operation to avoid that. Yeah, there are some people who are working on that for sure.
Yeah, and then in humans, you also have a different problem sometimes, which has to do with cognitive effort. I'm not sure if you've done any research on this topic, but where it's like, at a certain point, maybe you don't want to expend the extra energy necessary to get the right answer. Maybe you just want to stick with your biases and convince people that you're right.
That's fair too. I haven't done personally much, if any, research on cognitive effort. It's crept into some of the work that I've done on the relationship between what is kind of the mathematically optimal thing to do in this environmental condition versus what's good enough to have me as an organism not die right now.
Right.
And I think so that kind of plays into it a little bit. But I typically conveniently sidestep the idea of the cost of optimization or the cognitive effort that it is required to engage in these kinds of self-evaluation processes. That's something that I conveniently ignore in a lot of the work that we do.
So under what circumstances are humans usually going for good enough rather than optimal?
Oh, well, that's a big question. And I think the answer is probably much of the time. Like, I mean, evolutionarily.
Maybe the opposite question would be more useful then. Under what circumstances is good enough not good enough, and that we strive for optimal decision making?
Well, I don't know that we strive for optimal decision or that we can kind of switch regimes like that. I think that the way that our brains evolved, our minds evolved, what is this pile of good enough approximations, which under most circumstances probably are so indistinguishable from the mathematically optimal solution because they had to be, because if you really like deviated from that, then you wandered off a cliff and died. Right. And didn't procreate. So I think under most circumstances, this kind of collection of processes that have evolved that are conveniently describable under most circumstances by mathematical optimality probably aren't under the surface. And it's not just because we have limited resources. There's probably like, when we talk about the brain being optimal, we have to specify with respect to what is the thing that it's trying to optimize. And I don't feel like I'm not God. I don't know what the ultimate answer to the universe's cost function is. And so I think we can guess at that. But as you've just demonstrated, when we bring in subjective evaluation and emotion in risk tolerance, or we bring in costs of optimization like cognitive effort, it gets so much more complicated that I think it's a lot of hubris to think that we've got the cost function right.
Right. Yeah, but so like you said, we might be at least somewhat confident that it's right, if for no other reason than throughout evolution, our survival depended on doing good enough.
Right, but that doesn't mean that cost function that the system optimized is the same one that I'm asking my participants to optimize in some experiment where I show them a thing on the screen and ask them to press buttons. Like that cost function I can write down. But I think it's very weird to suggest that somehow our minds would be able to latch on to that cost function and turn off all the other pieces that are baked in and hardwired into our systems and just optimize that. I think that that's a very tall order. Right. And to the extent that it looks like we are doing that, it's simply because we haven't dug deep enough to see where we deviate.
To what extent do you think these processes are, here's another false dichotomy, sort of wired into us versus shaped throughout development based on having whatever exposures? So for example, one idea might be three-dimensionality of our physical world. Is that something that we're wired to process, or is it just that we grew up in a 3D world and everything we've ever experienced is 3D, so we started seeing things in that way?
I think so this is this is the place where I get to say it's both. Yeah, so certainly there are things that are hardwired. I think that we are, at least in our predisposition, to be able to resolve, say, three-dimensional information. Yeah, that's something that, like, the wiring is set up to do that well.
Yeah.
From the get-go. But we also know that if you cover one eye during the critical period, that if you go far enough in development with only input from one eye, and then but there's nothing actually wrong with the other eye, it just doesn't receive input. And if you restore that input, the subjective experience of a 3D world does not recover. Or maybe it can under certain circumstances, but the world doesn't look 3D.
Wow. Was that an experimental study, an old one?
Yeah, that's been done. Yeah. And so this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of push to, and like, you can train people and sometimes it does recover. And so none of these are hard and fast rules, of course.
Yeah.
But that, like, the kind of default is that, the early experiments with cats and ferrets where they literally sewed an eye shut in baby cats or baby ferrets as soon as they were born, and then they later restore visual information coming in from that second eye, and then they look at the organization of the cortex, the visual cortex. How does it, you can't ask a kitten, like, do you see in 3D, but you can go probing around in the brain, and you can do experiments where you present them with things like visual cliffs and other stuff, and you can kind of understand the degree to which they can resolve 3D information.
Yeah.
And the answer is that if you wait too long, that ability to integrate information from two eyes, which is necessary for 3D vision, it goes away, or it never develops in the first place. That cortical real estate is taken over by something else, and it's really hard to get it back, and so on. This is why it's really important to have folks go to places in developing countries where there are, birth defects or abnormalities that alter visual perception so early in life, and to fix them. Like, if a patient is born with a lazy eye, say, it's really important to fix that early in life, because if you wait too long, the brain's going to start ignoring information from that eye, and it's going to be difficult or impossible for true 3D vision to recover.
I see. Do you know of any virtual reality studies where there's sort of a mismatch between the perception and what's actually going on? So, for example, we've sort of trained ourselves to where if your hand reaches for something and touches it, then, like, it's on target, you're going to feel it. Now imagine a virtual reality setting where you have a virtual hand that's always, like, I don't know, a few inches off from whatever you try to grab. Do you think your brain would eventually adjust to that, so you start perceiving things as matching up to the new thing that you're perceiving in that virtual reality world?
Yeah. Have you ever done a rubber hand illusion experiment?
No, I haven't.
Okay, let me describe it, because this is cool. So the rubber hand illusion is a fun thing, and you can do this at home. Go and get yourself like a Halloween hand or something. Anybody who's listening, you can even like stuff a rubber glove and it'll work. So the idea is that you as the participant place your two hands on the desk in front of you like this, but one of them is occluded from your vision. Okay, so you have like a wall here. And then right on the inside of that wall, you can kind of see me here, right on the inside of that wall, so within your field of vision, you place a rubber hand. It's almost in the same position, but it's off by like that far, like 6 inches. And then the classic way that the illusion is induced is that the experimenter then will take like a paintbrush or something, or even just their finger, and like run their finger or the paintbrush along your real hand and the rubber hand at exactly the same time. So it's called synchronous stroking. And what will happen is that you will have this very strong feeling that that rubber hand is yours, that that's your hand. It's not that it's in the same place as your hand. It's not that you think it's your hand. You will have a subjective experience of ownership, that that is your hand, to the point that if I then threaten that hand with like a pair of scissors, you will freak out, even though it's not actually your hand. So this is really powerful, and sometimes you don't even need to do the synchronous stroking to induce it. Sometimes just placing the stuff on the like desk in front of you is enough. So yes, I think that, and you don't even need virtual reality. You can do these experiments where you use cues like closeness in space or simultaneity. So simultaneous visual haptic percept, which is like you watch the stroking happening. Like those are all clues to your brain that this is your hand. And so the result is this conscious experience that that thing is your hand, even if it looks like something that came off a werewolf. You still feel like it's yours.
Right. So that seems to be hard evidence that what we're experiencing subjectively might not map onto reality.
Yeah. But I think that it's not, it doesn't like make sense to go all the way to the other extreme to be like, there is no objective reality or anything like that. I think that what we are experiencing is an evolutionarily advantageous version of a physical world. But we know that perception is an illusion. I mean, any visual illusion that you've ever experienced is evidence of that.
So going back to the idea of statistical learning and picking up on these regularities, is there any evidence to suggest that that's what we do with perception? Because like, you know, at a particle level, you have just things going up and down and sideways all the time. And then, but once you kind of zoom out, you get these statistical regularities. So are we just picking up on those regularities, even if everything is really just sort of this like this quantum fuzziness?
All the time. Those regularities drive our perception in a completely fundamental way, such that, and it's so core to how we perceive the world that it is virtually impossible for us to deconstruct what we expect based on our sensitivity to statistical regularities in the environment from what the incoming data stream actually is right now. What we experience is the combination of those things. And it's really difficult or impossible to separate them out. Yeah. So in visual perception, like look around you right now. Anybody who's listening to this, look around you right now. Take a look at the orientations in your environment. There are probably a whole lot more vertical and horizontal orientations than oblique ones.
Right.
Your brain knows that. It's dedicated more cortical real estate and different types of processing to vertical and horizontal stuff than it has to oblique stuff, such that if I present you with a slightly oblique thing, your perception of the angle of that slightly oblique thing is going to be wrong, but it's going to be wrong in a very specific way that is completely explainable by an overrepresentation and over expectation of vertical and horizontal stuff in the world.
Oh, wow. So it's kind of like that neural network approach where you have like a whole bunch of maybe the fundamental unit is like, is it vertical or horizontal? And then you put two together and you can get diagonal, and then you put a bunch together. And so is it like if you're perceiving a curved line, what it really is a bunch of combinations, a slow iterative, like going from vertical to horizontal?
I don't know about that. I mean, we do have like horizontal detectors in our early visual cortex. So it's not the case that you can't process, that you have to like kind of fill in the gaps between vertical and horizontal and guess, say. So we do have, you know, neurons that for this spot in your visual field and this spot on your retina, they fire when they see an oblique thing. Yeah, we've got those. But there are fewer of those, relatively speaking, than there are ones dedicated to vertical and horizontal stuff. And that difference in resource allocation and in the resulting computation leads to very predictable illusions that we can describe with simple math, which is very cool, I think. And the same thing is true for like motion. So look around you again. How much stuff in your environment is moving? Not much. So we expect that things are stationary. That expectation, that sensitivity to the statistical regularity that generally stuff stays put, manifests in our perceptions of motion speed under high conditions of uncertainty. In the absence of good evidence that something is moving, reliable evidence that something is moving, you're going to think it's staying put, or you're going to think it's moving very slowly. Right. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. And we tend to be quite certain about our perceptions of those things. Now, if you're placed in an environment where there's more rapid change, or where there's a higher rate of you having error in your perceptions? Does your confidence go down over time? And then if so, how long does it take to recover?
That's a great question. So generally speaking, yes, you can have sensitivity to like the noise in your environment and you pick up on that. So there's this kind of online monitoring of the noisiness that absolutely we can do. And that goes into your confidence judgments, and that we can show that online monitoring of noise, variance in sampling of your environment, that estimate of variance in your environment can be used by the brain to kind of put pieces of information together in an optimal way. But I also believe, and this is actually some newer work that just came out last year, that our online estimates of noise are also not perfect and are also subject to this same rule that combines prior expectations and sensory information. But now I'm saying that it's our estimate of noise that follows that same rule.
Yeah.
So you can't even estimate noise perfectly.
There's noise in the noise judgment.
Yeah, exactly. There's noise in the noise judgment, and there's expectations in the noise judgment based on previous information. And maybe those expectations are not always right. And if those expectations are wrong, how does that lead to kind of these illusions of confidence that we tend to see?
Mm-hmm. Megan, this has been a very exciting high-level discussion, both on the philosophical end and on the technical perception end. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I wish we could keep going, but maybe next time. I'm really looking forward to other discussions that we might have. And thanks again for having me and taking the time. It's been really fun.
Thank you.